Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Senator Smith.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before I begin, can I acknowledge some fine young Australians in the gallery this afternoon, students from the Melbourne University Liberal Club.
To your question,
Mr. President,
Senator.
my question is to the Minister representing the Minister for the Environment, Senator Birmingham. Can the Minister advise the Senate how the government is tackling climate change without a big new electricity tax?
Order. The Minister for Education and Training, representing the Minister for the Environment, Senator Birmingham.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. And Mr. President, in addition to acknowledging the fighters for freedom up in the gallery today, I also acknowledge and thank Senator Smith for his question on what I understand is his 4th anniversary as a senator, and I congratulate Senator Smith on his significant contribution over those 4 years. Well, Mr. President, in terms of significant contributions, the Australian government is making a significant contribution to addressing and meeting and delivering and exceeding our targets and commitments to the world in relation to climate change. And we are doing this without, of course, a carbon tax being required, Mr. President. As was announced at the signing of the Paris Climate Agreement in New York last week, Australia is on track to meet and beat our 2020 targets for emissions reduction by some 78 million tonnes of emissions. We are doing that through 3 key pillars: the renewable energy target, the emissions reduction fund and the safeguard mechanism. But we are doing that, of course, without the need for a carbon tax in place. Our policies are working, they are succeeding, and they are doing so without those impacts that drove electricity prices, gas prices up. By some estimates in New South Wales, gas prices are 8% lower today than they would have been without the carbon tax. Electricity prices are 10% lower, and of course the Australian Treasury estimates that households have saved around $550 as a result of the removal of the carbon tax. And yet Australia is meeting and beating our emissions reduction targets, and we are playing an effective part in developing policies to further reduce emissions. In Australia's case, with commitments of reduction by between 26 and 28% below 2005 levels by 2030, which represents a halving of emissions per person, the 2nd highest contribution of that nature among all developed countries. A significant contribution and commitment by Australia, but of course backed up by our real action over the years in delivering on our commitments.
Senator Smith, supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Is the Minister aware of any alternative plans to introduce an electricity tax?
Minister.
Well, Mr. President, yes, it would seem that last week the Labor Party demonstrated that they heard nothing from the Australian people at the last election, learnt nothing in terms of the policies that they have undertaken in the past, that, Mr. President, the Labor Party are up to the same old tricks and same old approaches. And their carbon tax policy, of course, Mr. President, comes on top of a $100 billion tax agenda that they already have, Mr. President. The Labor Party is promising a $100 billion of extra taxes and then a carbon tax put on top of that. Well, Mr. Shorten's carbon tax will, as it did before, put jobs at risk, damage Australia's competitiveness, increase costs for Australian businesses and, of course, for Australian families. In something quite reminiscent for Australian voters, it was Mr. Shorten who said last week, let's be clear, there will be no carbon tax under Labor, but then, of course, released a policy showing that, in fact,
Minister.
There will be.
The time for answering the question has expired. Order. On my right, Senator Smith, final supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Can the Minister advise the Senate how a big new tax on electricity would affect jobs and growth, particularly in the manufacturing sector?
Order. On my left. On my left. On both sides. Senator Cameron, that includes you. And order. Minister.
Thanks, Mr. President. Well, the Labor Party love to talk about their concern for the manufacturing industry, but of course with policies like this we know they're just crocodile tears from those opposite. Because in fact those opposite are pursuing policies that would of course have a disastrous impact on manufacturing, on mining and on the energy sector. The coal, oil and gas industry directly employ around 65,000 Australians. 65,000 Australians. The aluminium sector employs around 17,600, and there would be significant impacts there. The construction sector, which the Labor Party is already trying to cripple, of course, under union corruption, employs, of course, around 1 million jobs across the board. And we would ultimately see fewer opportunities in all of these sectors because of greater costs that would be in place, less competitiveness for Australia, which would harm our economic transition as a nation when we can least afford it.
Thank you, Minister.